Hello guys, we are doing chapter 13, which is urban patterns. I'm Arturo, Ryan, and Layla, and Melissa. And yeah, key issue 1 is why do services cluster downtown?
The CBD, or the Central Business District, is the best known and most visually distinctive area in most cities.
The CBD is compact but contains a high percentage of business, consumer, and public services.
The CBD is the easiest part of the city to reach from the rest of the region.
Some different services found in CBDs include libraries, city halls, state agencies, and courts.
Semi-public services such as places of worship and social service agencies also cluster downtown. They place these there to create more business for bars, restaurants, and hotels.
There are some kinds of sports centers in CBDs which attract a large amount of people. There are many business services in CBDs like banking, financing, advertisement, and journalism.
Law in particular depend on proximity to professional colleagues.
There are a lot of personal relationships, which is a lot of face-to-face meetings, which can include top executives, junior executives, secretaries, and custodians.
Some consumer services in the CBD have a high threshold, which means there needs to be a certain amount of people for that business to be established. Others have a high range, which is when people are willing to travel farther for a service.
There are other services there which are strictly only to supply downtown workers, for example like lunch, restaurants, supply stores, etc.
In the CBD, they have really high rent because of stuff like land shortage, lack of residents, and lack of manufacturing.
The reason for a land shortage is because many of the services and businesses are clustered together.
The reasons for lack of manufacturing is because they need a lot of cheap land, and some of the bigger ships can't maneuver into the old harbors in the Central Business District.
The reason for lack of residents was because many people moved to the suburbs for cheaper land and for better schools, and also they moved out because there was too much crime, poverty, and high cost of rent.
The competition for land forces the CBD to expand above and below ground. Some examples could be like subways or skyscrapers.
Retailers pay high rent for street space because they want people to just walk in and out of their service to buy their products, and also apartments are high so that people could see the view and so that it's not that noisy.
One issue in the CBD is that it's difficult to obtain healthy food. This is called the food desert, and an example of it could be like Baltimore because there's very little places to find healthy food.
We are now on key issue 2, which is where are people distributed within urban areas.
In urban areas, people are distributed in many different ways. There are different kinds of models that they use to figure out where people are distributed. The first model is a concentric zone model, the second model is a sector model, and the third model is a multiple nuclei model.
In a concentric zone model, there are 5 different rings, and the first, most inner ring is the CBD ring, which focuses mainly on businesses.
The second ring is the zone of transition, which focuses mainly on low-income housing and industry.
The third ring is the zone of working class, which is composed of older houses and stable workers. The fourth ring is the zone of better residents, which is just a bunch of newer houses which are bigger.
The fifth and farthest ring is the commuter zone, which is basically built up of communities and small housing.
The sector model is similar to the concentric zone model, but instead of it expanding as rings, it expands in wedges. For example, as the cities grow, the activities expand outwards in wedges.
According to the multiple nuclei model, a city is a complex structure that includes more than one center in which different activities are built around. Is a multiple nuclei model, which is when a city is a complex structure that includes more than one center, and there's different activities that are built around it. Some examples could be a neighborhood business center, a port, a park, an airport, and a university.
More different than CBDs in the United States because the skyscrapers are restricted in Europe because they wanted everything to be exactly the same of their settlements, which is just flat, and skyscrapers are restricted because it doesn't match with their surroundings. They also differ because streets in Europe are very narrow because they are very used to using horses and walking and not using cars like in CBDs here in the United States.
Models in European cities have wealthy people in the inner circle and less wealthy people on the outskirts of the city. The wealthy people have the best shops, cafes, and restaurants and stuff like that. And the people on the outskirts have high-rise buildings to save space.
Also, the commercial follows through the spine, which means that when the wealthy people leave the inner city, they go and make their own central business district. There are now stages of cities in developing countries. One of the stages was pre-colonial cities, and they are mostly rural settlements, and very little cities like Tecnotan became Mexico City. The node for all this activity was for the religious Great Temple.
The second stage is European cities, where Europeans followed standardized plans to expand cities. So many South American cities have similar characteristics like the gridiron and the central plaza and churches and stuff like that.
The next stage is city since independence, and millions migrated to the city in search of work.
Key issue 3. Why are urban areas expanding?
Suburban expansion. So the peripheral model shows how inner cities are surrounded by large suburban areas.
Urban area is dense core land in between dense suburbs. An urbanized area has over 50,000 inhabitants. Urban cluster is over 2,000 and 50,000 inhabitants.
This is one continuous urban area.
Some examples of this is Boston, New York, and Philadelphia.
Annexation is legally adding land to an area.
The density gradient is populations changing the farther you get from a central business district.
Fewer people live in urban areas, and also there's fewer density between people in the area.
In this section, you need to understand what sprawl is. Sprawl is the movement of urban or industrial area into the adjoining countryside, which means that development like businesses and services are moving more into the rural area. U.S. suburbs are often characterized by sprawl. The negatives of sprawl is it costs a lot, it wastes land, and it wastes energy. It costs a lot to build new roads to connect the two developing or developed areas. Often the taxpayer, developer, or the consumers in the area pay for the development or the input of roads. When developers buy farmlands for later construction on them, they often waste a lot of prime farmland. You often waste energy making trips to the city. Developers buy farmland in order for people to begin construction on them in the future. Developers may reject land if their isolated sites, physical attributes, or prices don't meet their requirements. This causes pockets of development and gaps between our cities. Suburban populations have grown because many residents that live in the U.S. prefer to live in the suburbs. Suburbs offer detached family housing, privacy, personal parking, and opportunities for home ownership. Families are often attracted to the suburbs due to their low crime rates and low traffic rates. There are two different types of segregation in the suburbs. There is segregation of social classes and segregation of land use. In segregation of social classes, houses are built for a single social class, which means that the same social class are attracted to this place due to cost, size, and location. For segregation of land use, residents are often separated by manufacturing or commercial farming. Residential segregation was often people were often separated in levels. The people on the top and the people on the bottom, like the attic or the basement, were often poor people, and the people on street level were the rich, or people who own their own houses were the rich. Eventually, vertical segregation took over territorial segregation. New cities were developed, so it attracted people with similar lifestyles and income. This eventually ended up separating the rich from the poor. Suburbanization of businesses began when non-residentials began to move into the suburb. Consumer services have moved due to the location of their services, the price of the land. Eventually, a lot of clustering of shopping malls and retailing stores began to pop up in the suburbs. Shopping malls, often 2 stories tall with over 100 stores in them and extensive parking areas, began to pop up in the suburban areas. Malls attracted many ages due to the variation of activities and products that were sold. Offices that didn't require face-to-face services began to pop up in the suburbs. This benefited the workers greatly because they no longer had to make the long commute into the cities. The only negative was that the workers may have trouble getting to their job due to a lot of transportation options available to them. When driving in an urban area, people have a purpose for their trips. They're always going from point A to point B with a purpose. But often business trips cause many traffic jams, which causes a lot of air pollution in our atmosphere. Cars and trucks have a great flexibility in their destination, which allows for greater development in our suburbs. 95% of all families own a vehicle, and 1/4 of all our land are dedicated to roads. And in order for suburbs to function properly, there needs to be a development in our traffic. GPS plays a big role in our intelligent transportation system. They prevent congestion by educating drivers where congestion is so that they can avoid it overall. People are also informed of congestion over the radio. The car of the future: diesel, ethanol, plug-in hybrid, and full electric. Diesel engines burn fuel more efficiently with greater compression at a higher temperature than conventional engines.
In hybrid, it runs off of a gas engine, and then as soon as it's at its least efficiency, an electric motor takes over.
A full electric vehicle has no gas engine, it runs on battery. A plug-in hybrid, the battery supplies the power at all speeds.
Hydrogen fuel cell is hydrogen forced through polymer electrolyte membrane, which is combined with oxygen, and it creates power, which can power an electric motor. Regional variations in electricity is when electric cars power themselves from outlets from power plants. The U.S. generates 40% of the energy by burning coal. This reduces the use of petroleum, but natural gas will get an impact of that. And plugging into an outlet causes air pollution. So the electricity is generated differently around the world. Like in the Pacific Northwest, they use hydroelectric that doesn't do a lot of impact on the air like the Midwest does. Why do cities face challenges? Inner cities in the U.S. have low-income workers which face social and economic problems that differ from suburban residents. Changing in the physical geography is, so there are many houses that were built in 1940 which are now in very poor conditions, which leads into the process of deterioration. And deterioration is usually when low-income residents take over a land where middle-class residents were. And so what happens is that middle-class men leave further from the center to get away from low worker people. And so the first step is usually filtering, and that's division of houses which are rented to multiple families. And what happens is that they usually abandon it because of high rents. So the first step usually involves filtering, which is when the houses are divided and they're rented to multiple families at once. They usually last long, they're well maintained, and the rents are really low, but usually it ends up increasing, causing them to want to abandon the area, which also makes the landowner abandon the area because they don't get the money that's required to pay for the whole area itself. And so what happens is that the government then hunts down the landowner, and then the landowners are like, no, I'm out. So, yeah. An example would be found in Detroit, where in 1950 they had 1.8 million residents, and in 2010 they have 700,000 people, and the government's actually making them want to move out of that area because they really can't afford the infrastructure and all the services that are in there. So they encourage them to move out instead of stay there. Redlining is the second process, and it's usually when drawn on a map, and it indicates where the bank's not going to give money. So what happens is that it's really difficult for families to repair their houses because they're not getting enough money for it. And redlining is actually illegal, but nothing's really done about it. So I guess it's now no really worries to the government, right? It's not a priority. And the U.S. bank must document where they give money, and also banks elsewhere must give the equal amount of loans to different areas. So the third one is public housing, which is houses that are demolished and replaced with new ones. And in the U.S., they're usually reserved for low-income people who only pay 30% of their income as their rent. And the local governments are housing authorities, and the federal governments pay for the things that aren't covered by the actual rent itself, like maintenance and repairing the house. So the first public housing was in the mid-20th century. That was by US and Europe, but it didn't go so well for families who had kids because there were too many juveniles that were terrorizing people throughout the halls. a lot of druggies involved. The crime rates were way too high. Many low-income people were concentrated in that area, which probably was the reason housings were demolished. The U.S. government had stopped funding public housing, but there's a federal program called Hope 6, which actually encourages the remaking of public housing. And also there's another one called voucher program, which helps people with low income to pay for their rent. And so public housing has dropped 1 million units from 1980 to 2000s, although at the same time low income dwellings were increasing by 2 million. In Britain, their social housings are encouraged to be sold to other facilities that are non-profitable for different types, that are made for special housings like single mothers, disabilities, retirements, orphanages. Gentrification is a process of when middle-class men move into inner city deteriorated housing to renew them. Some of them are usually in good conditions because they were actually owned by elite figures, but usually they have to renew them, usually by the cities or public investors. Inner cities usually attract middle-class men because of their architectural details, the recreational centers that they have around them. Their neighborhoods are usually good for people who are single or in couples with no kids because they don't really have to worry about the schooling and stuff. The U.S. government says that if a family is forced to move out because of high rent, they must get paid at the max 4-year rent money. Cities usually rent public housing to low-income people who got kicked out of their houses, and they're usually more dispersed than concentrated in one specific area. Changing urban social geography. So inner city residents are usually underclass and live in poverty. Class is someone who is trapped in an unending cycle of economic and social problems. Underclass usually consists of high unemployment rates, drugs, alcohol, teen delinquencies, and also illiteracy. Children go to deteriorated schools, meaning that they lack efficient education. Affordable housing is very hard to find, and also there's no efficient recreational or health care centers around. People are unable to find jobs because they lack the skills that are required for the jobs, or they just can't compete because they lack education. More than 636,000 people are homeless out on the streets, either because of job loss, mental issues, or family problems that are occurring. An example would be found in Kolkata, India, where they have more than 100,000 homeless people bathing, sleeping, and eating on sidewalks. Culture of poverty. 3 out of 4 babies live with only one parent, which is usually their moms, and they have to make the decision whether to go to work and make money or stay home and take care of them. But usually the alternative is making money because you can't survive without money. Inadequate childcare services are provided, and also the government wants to see more dads with their family, but it's not really that encouraged and there's nothing really done about it. Although if the husband does end up going with the family will lose their welfare that they're in, and they'll probably worse together than apart. Inner city residents usually get their income from selling drugs, which is then how gangs are formed, and if 2 gangs encounter each other, that's when a gang fight occurs because they want to sell drugs in the same area and boundary. Neighborhoods are usually segregated by ethnicity and also social standards, and seeking a house in social standards is usually when you're trying to match the characteristics of the house to what class you are, if you're poor, middle, or if you're rich. Gentrification is also changing ethnic patterns. An example would be shown in Chicago, where whites are now increasing in inner cities and they're decreasing in the outers, and Hispanics are increasing farther from the inner cities and they're decreasing in the inners. Urban economic geography challenges. So since low-income people are so concentrated in inner cities, it's been causing financial problems. Low-income inner-city residents need public services, but they pay very little taxes for it. There's a growing gap between the services that they need and the availability of funds that they need to get for the services. There are many cutbacks on services that encourage middle class and also industries to move out of the center, like eliminating bus routes, eliminating libraries, eliminating trash collectors, and all of those services. They raise tax revenue, so they give tax breaks to downtown offices, luxury hotels, shops, restaurants, and all that fun stuff. They provide a minimum wage and also personal service jobs for low-income people in inner cities. Spending public money decreases projects that are in inner cities like playgrounds or subsidy housings. The impact of the recession. So it began in 2008 and the local governments were financially poor. What started the recession was the collapse of house marketing. So what banks used to do was loan monies to people who were buying their house, but now over the years that led up to the recession, what they do is they give large amounts of money to low-income people, which is known as subprime mortgages. Investment in housing is viewed as providing a higher rate of return at a lower risk than other investors. Inner cities are most targeted because most people are renting there, and also it gives financial investors a better opportunity to find more people to own houses. Although if people cannot repay the loans that they got from the bank, then what the bank does, like the lenders who gave them the money, will take back the entire property, which is also known as foreclosure. During the first year of the recession, 10% of the Americans were behind on their mortgage and also already in foreclosure. Although in recent years, housing prices have decreased in the US and other developed countries. But leading to that, the mortgage exceed the values of the house now that the prices are decreased. Reviving consumer services in the CBD. So retailing and leisure activities make people want to actually drive further distance to exotic places just to view shops or just like a central atrium with like a fountain in the middle or maybe even a harbor. Downtown malls attract tourists or suburban shoppers for their exotic designs and the unique experiences that you'll have at the mall. CBDs have actually restored food markets and replaced them with individual stalls who are owned by different merchants. Although they may have high range because people are willing to travel far distances for the exotic products that they'll find, inner cities actually use these markets for their weekly groceries because they face challenges trying to get groceries in urban areas.